So let me talk about election security and transparency, and particularly in 2020. But first, I want to talk about how we used to think about election security and transparency, let's say from 1850 to 2019. And you know, 175 years ago, elections in many parts of this country looked quite a bit different. There were no paper ballots, there were no ballots. You just told your vote to the election judge. There was no secret ballot, so that means if somebody was going to pay you off with whiskey, as we see in the lower left of this painting, they would know for sure that you voted for them. And this kind of chaotic scene led to pressure for reform by reform-minded people in the late 19th century who were concerned with how do we design election procedures that are honest, secure, accurate, transparent, inclusive, and in general, trustworthy. And what do we want? We want each person to vote, but just once. We want to accurately record the votes. We want to accurately count the votes. We want you to be able to be sure that your vote is counted without having to trust the other side's people, but sometimes the election officials are the other side's people. There should be no single person you have to trust. And this was particularly important to the people in the late 19th century. There should be the secret ballot. So not only you can't learn how a person votes against their will, but even with their cooperation, you shouldn't be able to learn how they vote, because if that's possible, then you can coerce or bribe someone to learn how they voted. And here's basically what they came up with in the late 19th century, the polling place. And many aspects of this polling place should look familiar to us even now. You sign in over there at the poll book. The poll book implies voter registration, which was a new thing around 1890. And there are two people at that desk with the poll book, not just one. There's a Democrat poll worker and a Republican poll worker. Sometimes there's also Democratic challengers, that is, volunteers representing the party to see what's going on, and Republican challengers. Then you take your unmarked ballot and you mark it in the privacy of the voting booth. And everyone can see that you are marking your ballot in private and that you're not telling anyone how you voted. There's this wooden railing to keep out the shoulder surfers. And you take your ballot over to the ballot box. And again, there's 2 or 3 people at that ballot box watching what's going on. And those election workers and challengers got to see at the beginning of the day that the ballot box was empty. They get to see who puts a ballot into that ballot box. That particular ballot box is high tech. A bell rings whenever a ballot goes in there, so everybody in the room knows that somebody voted. And at the end of the day, they open up the ballot box and count the ballots right there in the presence of witnesses from both parties. So even though there's no single person you might trust, you can trust the process because representatives of the parties and the candidates are there to make sure that it's being conducted honestly. And not only that, the voters and the public can see for themselves how the procedures work and understand how to trust the process, because everything makes sense. What happens 100 years later when you put a computer in that polling place? Well, you can't really see inside the computer. Even a computer scientist can't see inside the computer to really know what software programming is running in that computer today. And in fact, all computerized voting machines can be hacked to make them cheat. That's the touchscreen, the DRE, direct recording electronic computers can be hacked, the ballot marking devices can be hacked, the optical scanners can be hacked. That's sort of the fundamental flaw of voting computers, that a voting machine is just a computer in a box. And whoever programs the computer, whoever gets to install the program in the computer, really decides how it works, whether it honestly reports the inputs it got on its touchscreen, or whether it shifts votes around and reports something that favors whoever wrote the program. And so here's how you can commit election fraud by installing a fraudulent program in the computer. You write a program that on non-election days, maybe when it's being tested, it accurately counts the votes. And it can tell what's election day because every computer these days has a date and time clock. Your computer knows what day it is. But on election days, it cheats. Maybe it shifts 10% of the votes from one candidate's column to another. But it doesn't indicate that to the voter. The touchscreen interface will look perfectly normal. It's just the results are being recorded wrong. And the pre-election logic and accuracy testing won't catch this because the machine's not cheating when it's not election day. And now you need to load your program into the voting machines by exploiting some sort of security vulnerability. And modern computers, including modern voting machines, have many, many layers of software, from the application, the vote counting program at the top, to the runtime system and the operating system underneath them. There's software that runs the modem and software that runs the USB stick interface. There may be a hypervisor. There's definitely a BIOS. And bugs or software vulnerabilities that are inadvertent but omnipresent in all of these layers can be vulnerabilities by which hackers can install fraudulent programs at the top level that miscount your votes. With physical access to a voting machine, you can hack it by inserting a card. Every voting machine has some sort of card slot or USB slot by which election officials install before each election the ballot definition that says which candidates are on the ballot this year, which contests there are to vote for. But it's that same slot that is also used to upgrade the software in the voting machine. Every computer you have installs software updates from time to time. And the way you install software updates in a voting machine is by inserting a card in that slot. So if you can get physical access to a voting machine, then you may be able to install fraudulent software. And voting machines tend to be left unattended at polling places before elections and after elections. Once you've hacked it, it can cheat in every election for years and years. You don't have to hack it a new time before each election. But you don't necessarily need physical access. If your county's election management system is ever connected to the internet, even indirectly, then hackers on the internet can insert themselves into the election management system so that when the election administrator, the perfectly honest election administrator, transports a ballot definition file from the election management computer to the voting machine, they may inadvertently be carrying a virus with it that hacks the voting machine. Voting machines are hackable, but we would like to use computers to count the votes because when they're not hacked, they're very accurate and efficient about this. So what's the solution? Well, the solution begins with hand-marked optical scan ballots. The voter marks a ballot by filling in some of the ovals and inserts it into the optical scan voting machine, which is a computer with a scanner on the top and a ballot box underneath. Or you can use central count optical scan, where the voter puts the ballot into a ballot box, it's transported to the county central location where a high-speed central count optical scan voting machine counts the ballots. And so the consensus, the scientific consensus, as reported by this studies committee that I served on a couple of years ago at the National Academy of Sciences, recommended that all elections should be conducted by paper ballots that may be counted by machine, but those ballots can be recounted by hand without any computer telling you what it says on them. You can see for yourself. And indeed, most of the country now uses paper ballots, counted by machine, recountable by hand. That's all the states shown here in gray. And only a few states or counties within some states use paperless touchscreens, as most of New Jersey has been doing for the last 20 years, and so on. And even some of the states here shown in orange that were using paperless touchscreens in 2018 have now switched to paper ballots or some sort of paper trail. Now, those optical scan computers that count your paper ballots are computers, and they can be hacked to cheat. But the paper ballot that you put into them drops into a sealed ballot box, and election administrators should maintain a clear chain of custody of those ballot boxes so that they can be recounted. And a recount is by people looking at those ballots. It's more difficult to hack people, especially since the people doing a recount are usually in teams of 2 or 3 that represent more than one party and candidate. But a hand recount of the entire election is laborious and slow. So what you can do to gain assurance that the computers weren't hacked is a random audit. There are methods for taking a random sample of the ballots or the ballot boxes and reinspect or recount just those to gain a high degree of statistical assurance that the computers reported the right answer. So the modern methods for this kind of random audit are called risk limiting audit. A risk limiting post-election audit is an examination by humans of a randomly chosen sample of the paper ballots that can statistically assure that only an X% chance, that's called the risk limit, you choose what risk limit you want in your state statutes or whatever, that the election outcome claimed by the voting equipment would differ from the outcome that you would have obtained by a full recount by human inspection of the human readable portions of the paper ballots. Now, New Jersey has a law requiring a random audit of the paper ballots. It was passed in 2007. It's not quite for a risk limiting audit because that term and those methods were not very well understood in 2007. But it does require that a random selection of the ballot boxes, usually that means a random selection of the voting machines from the precincts that have the ballot boxes attached to them, should be opened up. You recount each of those ballot boxes and you make sure that the count came out to the same that the computer claimed. And if there is widespread election fraud by means of hacking computers or even mistaken configuration of those computers, then you have a statistically good chance of catching it by this kind of audit. Well, for the last 13 years, New Jersey has been in this position of having a law that requires the audits of election results based on the paper ballots, but having voting machines that don't have paper ballots. So this audit law was sitting there unused for all these years, except now this year in New Jersey, because of the pandemic, we are all voting on paper ballots. And so now every county in New Jersey will do ballot audits this year. And the audits this year will take place between November 23rd and December 4th. And you may be able to observe the election audit if you want to. You could ask your county election officials about observing or see if they list something on their websites. My hosts at the League of Women Voters in 3 towns in Union County, New Jersey, have asked me to talk about Union County's new voting machines that it purchased at non-trivial expense last year and would have gone into use this year if people were voting in person. And they're a form of ballot marking device. Now, ballot marking devices as a concept were invented about 20 years ago to enable accessibility for disabled voters to mark paper ballots. That is, if we're voting by hand-marked paper ballots that we feed into optical scanners or into a ballot box, in the 21st century, we want voters with disabilities to have the ability to vote independently. So these ballot marking devices were invented, and you can see it's a touch screen. Now, a blind voter can't really use a touch screen, but there's also an audio interface that the blind voter can listen to the ballot described in audio and use the blue buttons there on the lower right of the machine to choose from menus. And when the voter is finished, it prints out an optical scan ballot that can be put in with the rest of the ballots and counted. But in the last 2 or 3 years, the voting machine vendors and some states or counties have proposed that every voter should vote using a ballot marking device. So the idea here is that every voter goes up to one of these touchscreen machines in the polling place, indicates their choice of votes. The machine spits out a paper ballot. Typically, they look like the thing shown here with the list of their choices and some barcodes. And then that paper ballot can be inserted into an optical scan voting machine and counted. And the problem with ballot marking devices, especially ballot marking devices for all voters, is that the ballot marking device is a computer. It can be hacked just as easily as other voting machines. And if the ballot marking device cheats and changes votes, it can print the wrong votes on the paper, and most voters won't notice. And once they're printed on the paper and fed into the optical scan voting machine, then any audit or recount will also count the fraudulent votes because they're printed right there on the paper. And you would think that you would notice that, but a scientific study done in 2018 observed real voters in a real polling place in Tennessee. The observers stood off in the corner of the room so they could see the voters' behavior, but they couldn't see what was on the ballot. The voters used the same kind of ballot marking device that I show in this picture to mark a ballot and produce a ballot card, and then they carried it 10 or 20 feet across the room to the optical scanner. And the scientists could observe that 50% of the voters didn't even glance at the piece of paper that had their votes on it, so that if the voting machine had been cheating and printed the wrong votes on there, they wouldn't notice. And of the other 50% that did look at the piece of paper, they looked at it for an average of 3.9 seconds. Now, there were 18 contests on that ballot, so that's less than a quarter of a second per contest. If the voting machine was changing some of the votes somewhere in the middle of the ticket, you know, maybe not the presidential vote, but somewhere down the line in the vote for Congress or whatever, these voters wouldn't have noticed. So most voters will not attempt to verify paper ballot summary cards, even when directed to do so. These voters were given express instructions that they should inspect their ballot. Now you might think, that's all right, some voters will catch it. So last year, we published a paper with a scientific analysis of what happens. What happens if the ballot marking device is stealing 5% of the votes? That is, 5% of the time it shifts the vote from candidate Smith to candidate Jones. Now, 5% is a big deal. Lots and lots of elections are won by less than 5%. And if 5% of the votes have the wrong, you know, are cheating in the vote for Congress, and 5% of the voters actually read their ballot carefully enough to go down the line to see that it was cheating, well, 5% of 5% is about 1 out of 400 voters will catch the machine cheating. But what happens when the voter catches the machine cheating? They can raise their hand and say, this ballot doesn't have what I marked on the screen. And what's the poll worker supposed to do? What the poll worker is supposed to do is say, that's all right, we'll void that ballot and you can vote again. But that doesn't help all the other voters whose vote was stolen and they didn't bother noticing to look. You might think, well, I caught the machine cheating. Something must be done about that. But the poll worker can't know whether you really did indicate what you thought on the touchscreen or whether that was your mistake. You have no proof. And election administrators cannot invalidate entire elections because one voter out of every 400 raises their hand and says, that's not what I marked on the screen. So there's no recourse. You know, even if you catch the machine cheating, there's nothing you can do about it except just fix your own vote. So ballot marking devices are not adequately auditable and not securable because the recount will actually count the fraudulent votes. And all-in-one machines, such as the express vote that Union County bought last year, are even worse because the ballot that the voter's supposed to inspect is held behind that glass panel that you see on the right in dim light. It's hard to read. And worse even than that, after the last time the voter gets to inspect that paper ballot, the paper ballot travels into the ballot box by a paper path that leads it right past the print head, where if the voting machine had been hacked, it can print different things onto the ballot after the voter last got a chance to inspect it. So we should avoid touchscreen voting machines. Paperless touchscreen voting machines are a severe security risk, and actually ballot marking devices such as the express vote are also a very significant security risk because if hacked, they really can get away with stealing votes. The most reliable way from a computer science standpoint to vote is a hand-marked paper ballot counted by machines that maybe they're hacked, but at least the paper ballot that the voter marked with their own pen is the one that the human recounters will see during a recount. But let me talk about voting in the year 2020. How do we vote this year during the pandemic? How should you vote? Well, if you live in New Jersey or Oregon or a whole bunch of other states, you're going to vote through an absentee ballot. We could call it a mail-in ballot, but that's not completely accurate, as I'll describe. So you should carefully read the instructions and carefully fill out and sign the envelope with your identifying information, your name, your address, your signature. Try to sign it the way you signed your voter registration 20 years ago. And then well before November 3rd, as early as you can put your ballot into any one of your county's drop boxes. Drop boxes are new this year in New Jersey, and I'll show you them and I'll talk about them. They've been used in other states like Oregon and Colorado and California, Washington for many years now. If you're in Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or a whole bunch of other states, you should vote in person. Why the difference? Well, I'll explain that too. So the way we used to vote in New Jersey and lots of other states is in the polling place. 5% vote absentee, 95% in the polling place. In Mercer County, where I live, in the 2016 general election, it was up to 9% vote by mail, and only 91% voted in the polling places. But in other states out west, for years now, it's been pretty much all vote by mail. In Oregon, 99% of the voters vote by mail. They do have vote centers that you can come in and vote in person in a vote center. And 1% of the voters choose to vote that way. But in New Jersey, during the pandemic, for reasons of public health, we're going to be voting by mail. There will be polling places open on Election Day for voters who need assistance, for voters who can't get a mail delivery somehow or didn't get their mail delivery, or in one way or another would prefer to vote in person. Now, in any state during the pandemic, touchscreen voting machines seem like a particularly bad idea. They were not designed to be sanitized. Hand-marked paper ballots are safer as well as more secure. But when we vote by mail, where are the bipartisan safeguards that I showed you a picture of in the beginning? Where's the transparency? How do we see that the process really is honest and secure? Well, that's what I'll tell you about now. You can read for yourself the New Jersey laws about how absentee ballots work and what are the steps in the process and where the safeguards are. And there are 3 new laws passed just a couple of weeks ago to make this election go smoothly. Things that you would have to do if you were going all of a sudden from 5% or 9% mail-in ballots to 99% mail-in ballots. So here's how mail-in ballots work. You, the voter, you receive in the mail from your county election administrators a packet. Normally, you might have to request especially, but this year in New Jersey, every voter is going to be mailed their ballot automatically without having to request an absentee ballot. And that's true this year, maybe in 8 or 9 states that have always been doing this, and 3 more states that are doing it this year in the pandemic. And what's in that packet? Well, you've got your optical scan paper ballot. You've got the inner envelope that ballot goes in, that you sign and put your name and address. Then you insert that in the return envelope, and you're going to return the outer return envelope with those things in it. And here's what's on that inner envelope, right? You have to print your name and your address and what municipality you belong to, so that they know, which election this really is. Is it, which congressional district you're in, depends on which municipality you're in, and so on. And you sign it. And then you return it. You can return it by mailing it back. But this year, when we're not sure how fast the Postal Service is going to work, you might want to use the drop box. Drop boxes have been used in several states out west for several years now, but they're new in New Jersey. They were first used in the July primary this year. And there'll be a lot more drop boxes, several in every county. Some counties like Union County will have one in every municipality. And you can put your ballot in the drop box. Now, we would like to think that these ballots don't just sit around in sort of open trays in a clerk's office that there's nobody in or only one person in at a time. And we would like to think that the clerk's office doesn't leave their ballot vault open all day in all the weeks before the election. We would like to think that our ballots are more secure than that. And I believe in New Jersey, they probably are. So let me tell you my understanding of how it works in New Jersey, such as Union County, which are my hosts for this presentation. This year, in the 45 days leading up to Election Day, every single day, a bipartisan team of Board of Elections employees will visit every single drop box and collect the ballots. So when you put your ballot into a drop box, any day from the time you receive it to November 3rd itself, you can be sure that your ballot will get there on time. Of course, if you vote earlier than November 3rd, you give the election administrators more time to process it so that they don't have to be doing that on Election Day and the day after Election Day and so on. We get more of our results earlier. And Union County is going to collect its US mail from the post office twice a day. And again, the fact that these are bipartisan teams of employees vetted by the Board of Elections means that somehow your party is represented in that process, and there's no single person you need to trust. And it's brought back to the Board of Elections office for staging. I'll talk about what staging is, but this is also done not just by one person. It's in the presence of witnesses, and in fact, the public is permitted even to watch this part of the process. Staging is they open the outer return envelope, but not the inner envelope. This allows them to sort the ballots into separate batches for each municipality or ward in the larger cities. And then immediately on the same day they receive it, they can do signature checking. They can check that the signature matches the signature in the computer for your voter registration. And they can tell the computer that you voted in this election. So if they get another ballot with the same name on it, they won't also count it. And then it goes into the vault. And presumably, after they put this batch of ballots into the vault, they close and lock the door. So it sits securely in the vault in, Elizabeth, New Jersey. Can the public watch the process that I just described? Yes, in principle, there's a place for the public to see. The public isn't usually there. This happens every single day for 45 days. And there aren't that many dedicated observers who know what time to show up. So in principle, it's observable by the public, but in practice, that's not so easy. What if the signature on the ballot doesn't match, or if it's missing, or if the address isn't right? The ballot can be rejected for a bad signature, but not by just any county employee. There's a Board of Elections that has 2 commissioners nominated by the Democratic Party and 2 commissioners nominated by the Republican Party. And for each ballot that's proposed for rejection for a bad signature match, the Board of Elections has to vote on it. And this pretty well represents the interests of the 2 major political parties in each election. I'm not sure it so well represents third parties, and it's not clear how that system helps exactly in primary elections, but this is the way that New Jersey and other eastern states have protected their elections for well over 100 years, is by making sure that both parties are there to be able to watch each other. Now, signature verification is a big deal. In some states this year, in certain elections, up to 10% of the ballots were rejected for incorrect information or incomplete information or not matching signatures. In the July 2020 primary, only 2.8% of the mail-in ballots were rejected, but 2.8% is larger than the margin of victory in some congressional elections in New Jersey, so that's still a big deal. And you can see that several of those were, didn't have the voter certificate or didn't have, a matching signature on their certificate. So one of the new laws this year in New Jersey, which is similar to laws that exist in Western states already, is the voters have a chance to cure the signature. Since if the voter puts the ballot in a drop box in their town on October 15th, then by October 16th, their signature is being checked in the Board of Elections office, and the Board of Elections will send out a postcard right away or some sort of form explaining how they can correct their outer envelope and have their ballot counted. And this cure period, I think, is new in New Jersey, and it's very important. So traditionally, the way this used to work in New Jersey and in most states is on election day, the ballots can come out of the vault. The credentialed challengers are allowed to inspect the outer envelopes of these ballots to make sure they believe that these are legitimate, the signatures match, and so on. The challengers are also allowed to inspect the outer envelope, the certificate part of the envelope of ballots that are proposed, the Board of Elections has voted to reject. And after the inspection, you remove the certificate tab that has the identifying information for the voter. Then you take these batches of envelopes with the certificate tab removed, and you open the inner envelope and flatten and stack the ballot. Now you have a stack of ballots that you can run through the optical scanner. And this is the optical scanner. It can count 300 ballots per minute. So if you have a batch of absentee ballots from some town with 1,000 ballots in it, then in like 3.5 minutes, that batch gets counted. Well, if everybody's voting by mail, if it's 100% of the ballots by mail rather than 5%, then this can't all get accomplished in one single day on election day. So New Jersey has had to adjust its laws to permit this processing to start early. And it did so. The legislature passed a law and the governor signed it in August. So now what's going to happen this year is, starting a month before Election Day, twice every week on days to be announced in advance, the ballots will come out of the vault. The credentialed challengers will be permitted to inspect each ballot that's come out of the vault on that day. The public can watch from behind glass, I guess. Then it will be transferred to the processing facility. This next part can't be done in the Board of Elections office. It's too small to handle that amount of work during a social distancing pandemic. So the Board of Elections has acquired new and larger space for this next part of the process. Again, this is the twice a week thing. They start the processing. They remove the tab with the voter name and signature, and they add the ballots to the batch for this municipality and ward. Starting about 10 days before Election Day, they will start opening the inner envelopes, flattening and stacking the ballots. After each batch of work is done, it goes back into the vault, and I hope they close the door. A couple of days before Election Day, they will actually start scanning the ballots through the optical scanner. They're going to wait until the last days for this because they don't want results to leak. It is inappropriate for information about how the votes actually went to be released before Election Day. So they have all sorts of administrative procedures to make sure that nobody runs the report that indicates how many votes there are, but they also protect themselves by not even starting to run them through the scanner until, October 1st or October 2nd. And the scanners are high speed enough that they really can accomplish the whole process in a day or two. And then on election day, they can process and count the last batches of ballots. They can order the scanner to display the stored results. Since they're going to collect from all those drop boxes for the very last time at 8 p.m. on election day, that means they'll have more to count the next day. And since they will accept in New Jersey until 2 days past the election any ballot that was postmarked by election day, this process won't really completely finish until November 6th or 7th or whenever they can get it done. But since they will have been doing almost all the work beforehand, we can believe it will be efficient. This processing of opening the envelopes and flattening them out and so on, the public can watch by video in the lobby of their processing facility, and the credentialed challengers can watch from inside the room where they can see things for themselves up close if they need to. And remember, the challengers are representing individual parties and candidates. Not to mention that all the employees doing this are employees of the bipartisan County Board of Elections. So it's interesting to analyze which parts of this process the public can really observe and see for themselves, like I showed in that first picture of the 1890 polling place. What can you see? And the public, as represented by the bipartisan Board of Elections, can see pretty much everything up close except the ballot transport from the voter to the drop box, obviously, or they can't really see how it goes through the US mail. And then from the drop box to the board offices, the bipartisan Board of Elections is represented by these bipartisan teams of Board of Elections employees that go together to each drop box or to the post office. Then the staging process that takes place with each batch of ballots collected every day. Again, the bipartisan employees of the Board of Elections can see it up close because they're doing it. The public and the challengers could watch in principle from behind glass at the Board of Elections office, but then they'd have to show up every day and know what time of day to show up. So I don't know that, that's really so realistic. And then other parts of the process, similarly, the credentialed challengers can see it up close. These are the ones representing all the candidates that wish to provide them and the political parties. And the public can see, but at a slightly greater distance. Okay, well, not every state is voting by mail. So the states that are voting pretty much all by mail this year with sort of timely processing of the ballots, as I described in the weeks before the election, include New Jersey, but also lots of states that have been doing that for years, like Oregon and Washington and Colorado and so on. States that are encouraging vote by mail, mostly by, instead of mailing out ballots to all the voters, they're mailing out absentee ballot applications. And so states like that might very well see 60% vote by mail rate in the year of the pandemic. And these states are processing in a timely manner. And indeed, I have new information on Ohio that they are actually processing in a timely manner. And then there are some states that are just voting in person. They're not doing anything special to encourage vote by mail, but they're still handling the absentee ballots that do come in the weeks before the election. So that's fine. But what if the governor and the legislature did not adjust the laws and procedures for the pandemic? The old laws that worked when there were just a few hundred absentee ballots that you could do it all on election day. But if they insisted on using those same rules in the year of the pandemic, when in those states that are voting in person, they still might have 40% absentee ballots. Well, okay, so these states are voting in person with no advanced processing of mail-in ballots before election day, or in some cases, the day before election day. And that could be a problem. Those states could be struggling to process their absentee ballots for days after November 3rd. Now, what would really be crazy is to encourage vote by mail by sending out absentee ballot applications to everybody, or even ballots to everybody, but then prohibit the processing of those ballots before Election Day. And hold on, let me correct that. I have new information about Iowa. So that's Wisconsin and Michigan and Vermont. That could be a real meltdown in those states. The Michigan State Senate just passed a law saying, well, okay, you can start processing them on November 2nd instead of November 3rd. And if the assembly passes that and the governor signs it, great. But that's just one more day. These are the states that it's almost like the legislature wants things to screw up. All right, so that's how you should vote. If you're in one of the states that is doing vote by mail and has procedures in place to process it well, you should vote by mail. And if you're at all concerned about how slow the post office is, you use the drop box if in your state they have drop boxes. And if you're in one of the states where the processing of absentee ballots is not likely to go well, then you should vote in person. Put your mask on and social distance, but that's the more sure way of having your vote counted. So, mail-in ballot processing really has to start well before the election. And I'm glad that the New Jersey legislature and the governor and the Division of Elections have sort of gotten on board. Most of those other states that I've shown here in the green box have been doing all vote by mail for years. They had one election cycle after another to get up to speed on this and roll it out gradually. New Jersey had to do it all in 6 months, and New Jersey seems to have done a pretty good job of that. Okay, but how can citizens protect the election? Well, here are some things you can do as a citizen, right? You can help make sure that in your state, everyone has the right to vote and substantive access to the ballot. That's how the League of Women Voters got started. Somebody noticed that at least half the people in the country didn't have that right to vote and substantive access to the ballot. And you should learn how election procedures work in detail so that you can judge for yourself whether they are secure and honest and where they need improvement and observation. And you can observe election processes so that you can see for yourself. So that was easy to do when we voted in person. We could see for ourselves how the polling place worked. And it wasn't hard to show up when the polls close and watch what procedures they do to close the polls too. And we need election audits. These are necessary whenever computers count the votes, because if somebody installed a different computer program, you can catch it by a hand audit. So how are we doing in New Jersey? And these are just my sort of off-the-cuff subjective opinions, but I think New Jersey has done a pretty good job of ensuring the substantive right to vote and access to the ballot, and actually taking steps that it actually will be possible to count the ballots in a timely way. Now, what about learning how election procedures work? Most of us were actually, I'm sure, quite ignorant about what happens to absentee ballots after you stick them in the mailbox. But by now, I will give everybody in the audience 3 stars at least for knowing a lot more than you might have about how these procedures work. And you can judge for yourself whether these procedures are secure and honest. The reason I don't give 5 stars here is it's really hard to, there are a lot of different steps to the processing of absentee ballots. And I can't see the ballots at every step. It's just hard to know whether it's perfectly secure or not. But I think New Jersey is doing a pretty good job of this, as good as I know how to do, basically. And then you can observe election processes so that you can see for yourself. Well, I have not done that. I haven't. The last time I showed up in a superintendent of elections office to ask how the processes work was like 2004. And then audits. Well, New Jersey has audits now. A year or 2 ago, when they had an audit law but no paper ballots to audit, New Jersey would have gotten 0 stars. Now it gets 3 stars for having decent audits, not the most modern methods of risk limiting audits. And in some cases, audits of ballot marking device marked ballots that you can't really tell what was originally on the touch screen. You can only see what's printed on the paper. But New Jersey's come a long way in audits in just the last couple of years. And with that, I will conclude.